Coming up, the Grizzlies and Timberwolves win as two NBA superstars return to the court. This is Locked On Game to Game, NBA.
Every game, every team, every angle. Locked On Game to Game, your team every day.
Welcome in. You're listening to Locked On Game to Game NBA. Local experts join us to go over the biggest stories on the hardwood. I'm your host, Kainani Stevens. Thank you so much for making Locked On your first listen every single weekday. Ja Morant was back in action. He scored 17 points off the bench in his return with the Grizzlies, but it was Desmond Bane who led the way with 37 points. Memphis held off Houston and the Rockets. Locked On Grizzlies goes over the first game back for Ja and the win.
On a night where Ja Morant returned for the Memphis Grizzlies, they found a way to win, even though it wasn't the prettiest victory. Memphis continues to hold on to the number 2 seed in the Western Conference after a 130-125 victory over the Houston Rockets. I'm Joe Mullinax of Locked On Grizzlies. For the first time in his NBA career, Ja Morant, entered the basketball game as a reserve. And his role was different in other ways as well. It was Ja Morant drawing key charges, making major defensive plays. It was Jaren Jackson Jr. being the volume scorer. It was Desmond Bane being the one that you called late in the contest for key shots and putbacks. Morant took a more of a servant role in this game, allowing for the Banes and Jaren Jackson Jr.'s of the world to get the shine. Morant almost certainly will be a starter again sooner rather than later. But for one night, the other guys got the glory.
The Bucks embarrassed the Spurs last night. Milwaukee scored at least 30 points in every quarter, while San Antonio didn't hit that mark once. Locked On Bucks recaps that dominant victory.
Taking care of business is the name of the game for the Milwaukee Bucks down the stretch of the regular season, and they did that tonight by blowing out the San Antonio Spurs 130-94. My name's Kane Pittman. I'm the host of the Locked On Bucks podcast. We've spent a lot of time of late discussing how the Bucks are going to manage the upcoming schedule. Starting this weekend, they've got 5 games in 7 nights in 5 different cities, including a back-to-back in Utah and Denver as well. Currently, they have a 3-game lead in the loss column on the Philadelphia 76ers and the Boston Celtics, so they preserve that tonight. And if there is a way that you can save some legs in some of these nights without necessarily risking a loss, you get 23 minutes from Giannis, 24 minutes from Brook Lopez, another 22 from Drew Holiday. That is a nice way to lead into this difficult stretch in the schedule. So for Milwaukee, taking care of business. That's what they did tonight. They dominate a team that is not very good. And now the Bucks move to 52-30 on the season and keep themselves in the box seat for the number 1 seed in the East, which is going to be a big factor. Check out Locked On Bucks wherever you get your podcasts.
The Pacers picked up a win on the road thanks to hot shooting from the whole team while they were in Toronto. Locked On Raptors and Pacers both chime in with their thoughts after the game.
And they have only themselves to blame. Sean Woodley here from Locked On Raptors to break down the Toronto Raptors' 118-114 loss to the Indiana Pacers in Toronto on Wednesday night. A pivotal loss for the Raptors, who fall to 35-38 as they continue to push for the 8th seed in the Eastern Conference. It's going to be a lot more difficult to get there after blowing this one. And going into the game, the Raptors were without Scotty Barnes, Gary Trent Jr., and Precious Achiuwa. That's 3 of their 8 best players, 2 of their 6 best players when it comes to Scotty Barnes and Gary Trent Jr. They're big losses. It makes sense that you lose the game, in theory, 118-114 without those good players, until you realize that Indiana was without its best player and the guy who has driven all of their success this season in Tyrese Halliburton. Instead, the Raptors come out in this one, yes, shorthanded, but also totally lifeless on the defensive end. They get absolutely blitzed in the first quarter. The defense doesn't really show up until the second half. And outside of Pascal Siakam and Jakob Poeltl, who are both very good and very efficient, no one else really had a banner night for the Raptors in this one. Fred VanVleet scored a lot. He had 28 and 10, but he also was 7 of 22 and missed some timely shots. OG Anunoby was just 2 of 13 from the field, and Malachi Flynn was arguably the 4th best player on the Raptors, a guy who hasn't been in the rotation for weeks. It is as embarrassing and as inexcusable a loss as you're going to get for the Raptors. They have a chance to get back on the right track against the Pistons on Friday, but this game against the Pacers certainly doesn't give you a lot of hope if they're going to be without Barnes, Trent, Nachua, or even just a couple of those guys on Friday. I'll have more on this game broken down in tomorrow's episode of Locked On Raptors. Be sure to tune in.
Pacers get it done. Big road win for the Blue and Gold in Toronto over the Raptors. I'm Tony East, the host of Locked On Pacers, and the Pacers beat the Raptors 118-114 because Andrew Nembhard was phenomenal. The Canadian guard playing in the arena of his favorite childhood team for the first time, starting with Tyrese Halliburton out, 25 points, 10 assists. He was 11 for 17 from the field, carved up Toronto. He got into the lane and made passes in the pick and roll. He drilled shots, including the dagger three. He played nice defense, guarding Pascal Siakam at times. He was fantastic and huge for the Pacers in this game. Miles Turner was solid. Benedict Mathurin, another Canadian, was solid. And the Pacers slowly figured out the Raptors' defense throughout this game to get it done late and keep their play-in hopes alive behind the play of their two rookies. We'll have more on the Locked On Pacers podcast.
Coming up, the Warriors won in Dallas last night, but the Mavericks disagree. This is Locked On Game to Game NBA. Today's edition of Locked On Game to Game NBA is brought to you by Ultimate Pro Basketball GM. If you've ever dreamed of being an NBA general manager and managing your own basketball franchise, this is a way that you can play a game and do exactly that. You manage every strategic aspect of your team. You hire the coaches and assistants. You trade and train your players. You also get to make draft picks and select free agents. So trust me, it's definitely something you want to check out. You use our Locked On NBA code, Locked On, in the game store to give you a 100% free boost to your franchise. Make sure that you check that out. To download the game, you just visit probasketballgm.com, scan that code, or you can look it up in the App Store. That's probasketballgm.com. Ultimate Basketball GM. Start your dynasty today. Welcome back. You're listening to Locked On Game to Game NBA. I'm your host, Kainani Stevens. Thank you for making Locked On your first listen every weekday. The Golden State Warriors beat the Mavericks last night, depending on who you ask. Dallas is protesting the 2-point Warriors win, and Locked On Mavs tells us more about why.
Another loss that just makes you go, how? Why? What happened? What was that? Dallas Mavericks fall 125-127 to the Warriors, who had just been horrendous on the road and now have 2 straight road wins. The Dallas Mavericks lose this game, and there are just so many questions. The Mavericks now have 9 clutch losses since the Kyrie Irving trade, the most in the NBA. It's how much time is left? Can the Mavericks get it on track? Can they figure it out? Can they get healthy? Luka played in this game. He's back for the first time in a little while. Kyrie missed this game with foot injury. Luka also looked like he re-injured that leg during this game at certain points. It just was a weird one for the Mavericks in a weird season. And the only bright spot, really, Jaden Hardy off the bench, 27 points. He was absolutely incredible, shooting the ball, becoming another option. No Kyrie. Tim Hardaway Jr. out as well for the Mavericks. They needed somebody else to step up and score, and Jaden Hardy was that guy. He was the lone bright spot in another confounding loss.
The Washington Wizards could not find a rhythm after halftime. They let the Nuggets pull away for a win in Washington. Locked On Wizards recaps the Washington loss at home.
Well, what's good, Wizards fans and NBA fans? The Washington Wizards lose to the Denver Nuggets 118-104. It was the tale of two halves. The Wizards stuck with it in the first half as they were only down by 2 at the half, or I want to say they were actually winning at the half. But that third quarter was the difference of the game. They lost the third quarter 39-16. Michael Porter Jr. was on a hot streak, hit a couple of threes. He hit 6 threes tonight. Aaron Gordon hit 2, Jokic hit 2, and Jamal Murray hit 3 threes. The bright spot of the night was Denny Avdija with 16 points, Kristaps Porzingis with 25, Johnny Davis with a scoop layup as well, an up and under jelly layup, and he had 7 points. So tonight was development without Bradley Beal, without Kyle Kuzma. It looks like the Wizards are turning to development and maybe a soft tank for the rest of the season. But the Nuggets were just the better team tonight. They dominated in the second half. Just want to thank you guys for listening. Hail to the Wizards. Peace.
Jimmy Butler's 35 points led the Heat to a win over the Knicks on Wednesday night, and Locked On hosts from both teams tell us both sides of the final from Miami.
The Heat beat the Knicks 127-120 and have a chance to climb further up the Eastern Conference standings. I'm Wes Goldberg with Locked On Heat. Jimmy Butler finished with 35 points, 9 assists, and 4 steals. Tyler Hero made 4 three-pointers in the fourth quarter, and the Heat, as a team, did 2 things well. They defended Julius Randle, limiting him to just 15 points on 16 shots, and they made threes, 57% of them. Most importantly, the win pulls them to within a percentage points of the 6th-seeded Brooklyn Nets, who they're going to play in Miami on Saturday, and within 3 games of the Knicks for the number 5 seed, with another matchup still on the schedule. The Heat have now won 6 of their last 10 games. They're getting big games from Jimmy Butler, big fourth quarters from Tyler Hero. Kyle Lowry has settled into his 6-man role. Kevin Love is starting to fit in, and the Heat have been winning some games. For more on tonight's win, check out Locked On Heat on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts.
The New York Knicks, once again, the victim of a not-so-good shooting team shooting the lights out. Who's to blame? That's up for debate. The Knicks fall 127-120 to the Miami Heat in Miami. The Heat now just 2 games in back of the Knicks. The Brooklyn Nets just 2 games in back of the Knicks. And I, for one, am asking why. It was a struggle defensively. Josh Hart, who by and large has been excellent on that end of the floor for the Knicks, really struggled to contain Tyler Hero, both off the dribble and getting lost off the ball and giving Hero open shots from 3. And then by the time the Knicks started covering Hero pretty well, he was already too hot. He was draining. Jimmy Butler also absolutely torched the Knicks. So there's just Jimmy Butler being a great player and maybe a slightly generous whistle. But then you also take into account guys like Max Strus, Gabe Vincent getting really hot, partially due to lackluster defense from the Knicks. Miami bullying Jalen Brunson all night, and the Knicks never really had a chance in this.
Karl-Anthony Towns returning from injury and helping the Timberwolves get a 1-point win over the Hawks in Minnesota. Locked On Wolves and Hawks have more after that back-and-forth finish in the Twin Cities.
Karl-Anthony Towns is back, and the Minnesota Timberwolves are back to 500 and back in the 7th spot in the Western Conference. I'm Ben Beacon, host of the Locked On Wolves podcast. The Timberwolves beat the Atlanta Hawks by a single point on Wednesday night, and Karl-Anthony Towns came back for the first time since late November after missing 51 games. Cat started and was on I guess what you could call a minutes restriction, but a pretty limited one. He still played 26 minutes in this game, scored 22 points, had 4 rebounds, 3 assists, hit a pair of threes for his first 2 made field goals of the game, and came up big in crunch time. But the Timberwolves down 1 with 7 seconds to play. Cat went to the basket, was fouled by John Collins. It was upheld after a Hawks challenge. Cat sunk both free throws with just over 3 seconds on the clock, and a last-second heave from DeAndre Hunter from the right wing after a Hawks timeout clanged off the rim. The Timberwolves boxed out, got the rebound, and the game was over. This was a huge Towns performance in his return. We'll break it all down on the post-game pod. Subscribe to Locked On Wolves for all things Timberwolves.
Hello, friends. My name is Brad Rowland, and the Atlanta Hawks fall at the hands of the Minnesota Timberwolves in dramatic fashion on this Wednesday evening. The Hawks were in control, up by 11 points with 8 minutes to go. But from there, it was all Minnesota, and at the end, there was controversy, a call that went to Minnesota. In the final 3 seconds of the game, Karl-Anthony Towns draws a foul on John Collins. It was reviewed. It was not overturned. And then the Hawks had their chance go begging at the very end of the game. They had chances throughout the crunch time period, a 3 in the air for Bogdanovich that would have probably sealed the game in the final seconds from the Hawks. But kind of a familiar story for this Hawks team this year. Lots of missed opportunities. And with this loss, they're back under 500 for the season, back-to-back with a chance to steal one on the road. They just did not have quite enough juice on this particular night. We'll have a full breakdown of this game and more on Locked On Hawks podcast.
Lauri Markkanen dropped 40, but it wasn't enough for the Jazz after Damian Lillard and the Trailblazers did what they do. Locked On Jazz tells you why Utah just couldn't pick up that win at home.
After back-to-back impressive wins against the Boston Celtics and the Sacramento Kings, the Utah Jazz came out feckless tonight against the Portland Trailblazers, falling 127-115. David Locke of Locked On Jazz. Jazz led this game by 5 at the end of 1, but then fell behind by 15 in the third quarter. The Jazz have not come back from a 15-point third quarter lead all season. However, Portland has blown the second most amount of 10-point third-quarter leads, so you thought there was a chance, and the Jazz walked it all the way back to a tie ball game. But Dame Lillard's supporting cast had other plans, as the Blazers had 6 players in double figures, including Watford, Nurkic, and Sharp all over 20, while Lauri Markkanen did not get that kind of support. Lauri had 40 for the Utah Jazz, but only got help from Chris Dunn's 15 and Kelly Olynyk's 12 along the way for the Jazz, who just did not have the juice that they had against the Kings and the Celtics for surprising wins tonight. They notched a surprising loss.
The Suns and Lakers went down to the wire in LA last night with plenty of playoff stakes for both teams. Locked On Lakers has more about that final in LA.
This is Andy Kamenetsky, co-host of Locked On Lakers podcast, and the Lakers get a 122-111 win over the Suns, and Darvin Ham's lineup switch paid big dividends. Malik Beasley moved to the bench in favor of Austin Reaves, who was coming off a 35-point, 6 rebounds, 6 assist game against the Magic, and Reaves responded with 25 points, 12 of 13 at the line, and 11 assists against just 2 turnovers. Magnificent night for Austin Reaves. Anthony Davis, huge third quarter en route to his 27 points, and D'Angelo Russell chipped in 26 of his own. The temporary big three of sorts for the Lakers coming through big, and the Lakers are now back in the play-in mix of the standings. A lot more to get into, so make sure you are subscribing to the Locked On Lakers YouTube channel and that you make Locked On Lakers the first listen wherever you get your podcasts.
That's a wrap for this edition of Locked On Game to Game NBA. Thank you for making Locked On your first listen every weekday. Make sure you subscribe to Locked On NBA and your favorite team's Locked On podcast on YouTube and wherever else you get your podcasts from. I'm Kainani Stevens. This has been Locked On Game to Game.